If you're confused about some of the things that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11 and what they mean for you, don't worry, we've got you covered. Let's dive in. Admittedly, Matthew 11 is one of the more confusing chapters in the book of Matthew when it comes to the kingdom narrative or the kingdom gospel that Jesus is preaching. It begins by telling us that Jesus sends out the 12 after he finishes giving them instructions to preach in their cities. And then it tells us that John the Baptist has been imprisoned and that his disciples have heard the works of Christ and they have been sent by John with this question that we see in verse 2. Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? John is not uncertain about what he's asking. Basically, he has deputized his followers to go to Jesus. He wants them to see that Jesus is who they need to follow. And Jesus answered them, go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me. So you've got a beatitude statement there. Something I didn't notice until the Bible reading today is that you have this blessed statement, this beatitude statement. Blessed is he who does not take offense at me. So the one who comes to me and is not offended or does not hindered by his fear or offense, that he's going to be blessed. And so basically what Jesus is doing here is he's extending an invitation to the disciples of John to come to him. This is your first insight, is that Jesus is actually quoting from Isaiah 35 about the happy future that was going to come to Zion when the Redeemer came. What Jesus is telling John is, yes, tell your disciples that all these things are being fulfilled. They can come to me and they will be blessed. Now, again, a lot of times this is positioned as John has some kind of doubt. It really doesn't say that in the text. I know I even thought that at one point years ago. It doesn't say that John is doubting. Jesus is extending essentially a personal invitation to them, the very same invitation he's going to extend to us later in the chapter as our fifth insight. But we'll get to that in a minute. Jesus speaking to the crowd, and it says, what did you go into the wilderness to see? Why did you go out and look for John? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Did you go look for a weak man? Was he a soft man? Was he somebody with a lot of prosperity? Why were you coming to John? Those who wear soft clothing are in king's palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, I tell you, and one who is more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. I told you back in Matthew chapter 3 that when we got to Matthew 11, we were going to see this reference to Malachi 3:1 about the messenger that was going to go before Christ. That's why John is Elijah. And yet what you see is that Jesus calls John the greatest prophet that's ever been. So this is point number 2. Jesus is going to say something really strange here. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Well, what did he mean? What did he mean by that? Well, we're going to get into that in just a second, but we need to read a little bit further. It says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Elijah's work was to turn the people back to God. Elijah's work was to show who God was, who truly reigned in Israel. That was John's work, was to turn the people back to God, to get them ready for the coming Messiah. And so what he's saying is, if you can hear this, then what you need to understand is, just like Elijah's message, think about Mount Carmel. Elijah's message was everybody needs to repent and turn back to God. That was John's message. That's what they came out into the wilderness to see. But why does he say the one who is least in the kingdom is greater than he? Because John's message was the kingdom is coming, but the one who is least is actually responding to that message that he is part of the kingdom. So when we're thinking about that for just a second, let's set that aside for a moment. So what are we saying here? What we're saying is Jesus is recognizing that John the Baptist had a very specific work that no one else could do. It was very similar to the work of Elijah. but it was also something that was merely preparing for the kingdom. But John wasn't actually teaching the gospel of the kingdom the same way that Jesus was. It's not saying their work is more important than John's, but it's a greater blessing. It's better to be the least in the kingdom than it is to have the work of John the Baptist. He then talks about why they weren't receiving John, that they wouldn't receive him because he didn't eat and drink, so he must have a demon. They won't receive the Son of Man, which again is a Daniel 7 reference. It's a direct appeal to Jesus's deity. Point number 3 here, because he eats with sinners and tax collectors, and yet wisdom is vindicated by her deed. This is like the he that has an ear to hear, let him hear. What he's saying is, you should have seen John and seen that he was from God, because he was Elijah turning you back to God. You should see that I am from God because the works that I'm doing, yet you resisted both of them, except for the people who came out of the cities into the wilderness because they wanted to see someone speak on God's behalf. So what he's doing is he's actually breaking down here why it is that the Jewish elite are not going to be part of the kingdom, because they weren't willing to come to John's message. In fact, John has been imprisoned not by Rome, but by Herod. We'll find out in just a chapter, and he's about to be put to death for that. Then Jesus carries that forward and wants to know, what are they going to do with the message that they've received? This sounds exactly like what we heard in chapter 10 when he says in verse 21, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, that those were kingdoms that were judged for their wickedness, they're mentioned in Isaiah, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, I say to you, it is more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum. Capernaum was kind of Jesus's home base where he did a lot of his teaching. Will not be, and you, Capernaum, will not be exalted to heaven, will you? You will descend into Hades. Basically, you're going to death. And he's not condemning everybody in the city, but what he's saying is, most of the people in Capernaum, even though he was there a lot doing these miracles, hadn't turned to him. Think about that statement that he makes in verse 19 about being vindicated by wisdom, and in verse 6, blessed is he who does not take offense at me. Most of the people in Capernaum, he might have had a large group of followers, but most of them hadn't turned to him. And what we're going to see in just a couple of chapters when we lay it beside John 6 is that most of them are probably going to turn away from him. He says, you're not going to be exalted, you're going to go to death. For if the miracles had occurred in Sodom, which occurred in you, it would have remained to this day. Nevertheless, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you. So that's the same statement he made back in chapter 10. At this time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and have revealed them to infants. It's those people who saw the need for what John was preaching that were coming into the kingdom, and that are now the people that are responding to the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus is preaching, that are going to come into the kingdom. That those are the people that the world disregards, the sinners that Jesus was eating with, that the Pharisees and the scribes disregarded. Jesus is saying, no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal. Jesus has already said who he chooses to reveal the Father to. He that has an ear, let him hear. So the one who will hear is who Jesus chooses to reveal the Father to. He's not randomly choosing people. He's already told us who he chooses, the one that has an ear to hear. And then he makes this statement, and this is one of the most beautiful statements in the entire Gospel of Matthew. It's one that I would double star, triple underline. I'd write a big note beside this in my journaling Bibles. Check out the links in the description. Last time I checked, they're still on sale. But look at what he says here. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden. Well, weary and heavy laden of what? The previous chapters, we've been told that Jesus has compassion on the people because nobody is leading them. Nobody is teaching them. Nobody is directing them toward God. They're coming out to him for the miracles. They're staying for the gospel of kingdom. He has compassion on them. What are they weary of? They're weary of sin. They're weary of being excluded by people who think their personal righteousness is sufficient for the kingdom of God. He says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus is saying, I'm giving you a new yoke. I'm going to give you a new burden. I'm going to give you rest, not just rest for diseases. I'm going to give you rest for your souls, because you are tired of not having a leader that cares about you. All right. So that is your 5 pieces of insight from Matthew chapter 11. I want you to think about this. What did you journal that maybe I didn't include? I think this is one of the most beautiful passages in the book of Matthew. Hey, be sure to check out those links in the description. Also, if you are a Christian man and you're wanting some encouragement and insight, check out our sister channel, the Man Up Podcast, where we're doing a 12-week, 12-question challenge to make us better fathers, husbands, and leaders. I hope you'll join in for that and check out that podcast as well as get the free workbook. But until I see you tomorrow to talk about Matthew 12, have a good day and God bless.